My name's David Goodman. I work in the Department of China Studies here at XJTLU. And the department has decided this semester to put on a series of lectures in English for anybody who wants to come, just to introduce the kind of thing that we talk about when we talk about China studies. And we thought it would be of interest to all of you, really, whoever you may be, whether you're from within the university or from without the university. They're quite general. They're supposed to be entertaining. If you fall asleep whilst I'm talking, I'll join you because I'm very tired too. But other than that, we hope we can do that. I'm going to give the first one of these public lectures just to kind of set the scene. And I'm going to talk about 3 myths of China. By myth, I don't mean things that are false necessarily. I mean the things that everybody knows about China, but really which you need to ask yourself, is this the whole story? There's an element of truth in the 3, as you'll see in a minute, but there's also something you need to keep in perspective and understand that they're not the whole story. And these 3 myths are that China is rising, getting wealthier, that China has a long history, and that Chinese people are all the same. Everybody knows these 3 things without any question. So let's start off with the first one. Here's the Wall Street Journal from a few years ago, telling us that not only China's rising, but that we should be worried about Chinese rising if we live in East and Southeast Asia, because the rise of China will create problems for the region. Well, let's try and take this idea apart a little. Is China rising? How many countries are there in the world?
150.
What?
230.
Right, a couple of hundred. Yeah, almost. Okay. And when we say China is rising, how far down did it go before it started to rise? Give me a guess. Out of 200. Well, how low was it? Just shout out a number.
50.
50. Okay, anybody else? Anybody else? Everybody thinks it was at 50th, do they?
73.
73. Tom, well done, you're getting close. Anybody else?
120.
120. Good. Thank you very much indeed. All right. Now just keep those numbers in mind as we go through this. There's no question, of course, that China has changed. Everybody knows that. This is 1976. And the change is quite substantial, isn't it? We've gone from the old steam train to the new Gaojian. And of course, we all know that China has long been in the doldrums economically. Napoleon, like you guys, who said 50, 73 and 120, Napoleon said, reportedly in 1803, China is, on its uppers, not doing anything. Well, let me tell you something. At the time that Napoleon said this, what was the largest economy in the world? China. Yes. How could it be otherwise? How could it be otherwise? Most population, no industrialization, GDP per capita is about $650 at today's terms. That's how you get big economies if you don't have industrialization. And you've got to keep the scale of China in mind even today, because, of course, China was never lower than 4th. Never lower than 4th, ladies and gentlemen. Not 73, not 120, not 237, but 4 in 1978, when the decision was taken to change. It was the largest economy in the world until Britain came along, and America came along, and Germany came along, and Western Europe came along, but fell behind. But this is, look at the history of the thing. In the 1950s and the 1960s, when China is not supposed to have grown rapidly, it had a growth rate better than the United States, better than the Soviet Union, better than anywhere except Japan and South Korea. 6% per annum. And if you think about it, it's logical. It's totally logical. Here was a country that was ravaged by war and civil war for 150 years. It was in a mess in 1949. It had to start growing. It decided to start growing. It wanted to modernize. It wanted to have teachers and roads and postal services. So GDP per capita increased 6% per annum, even through the Cultural Revolution. So bear that in mind, because it wasn't negligible. Where does that leave us, though? Does it leave us with a rich China? No, actually it doesn't leave us with a rich China. I said to my driver the other day, I'm going to Mexico, which I am on Friday. My car, the guy who ferries me around, I said, I'm going to Mexico. I said, terrible country, he said, Mexico, full of poor people. Oh, I said, well, which do you think is wealthier, Mexico or China? What do you think he said? He said, China, of course. China's much wealthier, isn't it? No, it's not. It has Mexico has 3 times as much wealth per capita as China. 3 times as much. Now look at the figures. Those figures, by the way, on the right are GDP per capita. The ones not in brackets are PPP, purchasing power parity, and the other ones are unadjusted, nominal value GDP. $7,500 US is $5,000 a head is not actually very much. You know, of course, you all live in one of the richest parts of the world. To be frank, you live in the Goodman, in the Suzhou industrial park. Do you know that GDP per capita here in the industrial park is now higher than the United Kingdom? Higher than Liverpool? My goodness, isn't that a shock? But it is. It is. Even Jiangsu province, the province we live in, which has a very large poor part, it has a GDP per capita of 123,000 and something renminbi a year. That makes it actually quite well off in world figures, quite well off indeed. But as a country, China is not rich. It's poor. Its government is not poor, but as the people are poor. Well, and that's the thing. That's the thing. But this is not an argument. This question about China rising is not an argument about statistics. It's about what happens if a country gets rich or has wealth, or government has wealth, in the region. Will it then mean that it will bring China into conflict with the countries of East and Southeast Asia? Well, let's look into history. What happened? Was China influential in the region in history, in the past? Well, of course it was. The Japanese couldn't even invent their own writing system. They had to take the Chinese writing system. Sorry, Alan. It's a bad joke. But all the countries of the region, all the countries have had the influence of Confucianism and Chinese religions and all kinds of things. Where's this a picture of? What?
The screen went black.
Oh, did it? Sorry. That's just my brilliance, you know. Where's this a picture? Does anybody know what this is? I'll give you a clue. It's a Confucian temple. Where is it? Shandong province. Well, that's an intelligent answer, but it's not. It's Vietnam. It's Hanoi. Oh, really? You mean Chinese influence went as far as Vietnam? Oh, sure it did. Of course it did. It went. You can go to Vietnam now. You can go to Korea now, and you can see lots of Confucian temples and lots of things which are, as you'll see in a minute, there's a good reason for this, which is, of course, that the Chinese, to give my game away, the Chinese empire, as it was, didn't know boundaries. So, you know, Chinese influence went that way. But there's actually a point about this, beyond that, that has to do with the concept of China rising and whether China rising will actually negatively impact the countries of the region. Vietnam is a good example. All the countries round what we now regard as China were regarded by the Chinese as tributary states. Some of them even thought of themselves as tributary states because it was easier to do so. Vietnam is a classic example. And, you know, did that cause conflict? No. They lived together. And that's an essential part of the story I'm about to tell you. In about 1100, oh no, start again. It isn't true I'm going to tell you about 1100. The Chinese army used to use elephants. The Chinese elephant from Fujian. They used to use them not as battering rams, but as to carry soldiers into battle. Around 1100, the Chinese elephant died off. Whoosh, they used them all up. What was the army to do? How were they going to get their soldiers into battle? They couldn't do it on the sides of elephant anymore. They used to have planks along the sides of the elephant, and the soldiers would sit with their pikes and go into battle. Very, very grand. You can imagine a big elephant lumbering towards you with loads of Tang Dynasty soldiers outside. Anyway, about 1100, the elephant dies out. There's a magistrate of the empire down on the southwestern border with what is now Vietnam. And he notices that the Vietnamese have elephants. which indeed they do. They're a bit smaller. He writes back to the captain, he says, they've got elephants down here, they're a bit smaller, but we should ask for the elephant to be given to us as tributary so we can use them in battle. And of course the capital and the emperor said, yeah, what a great idea, ask for the elephants. And they go to the emperor of Vietnam, because he called himself an emperor too, and said, can we as our annual tribute have elephants? And of course the Vietnamese said yes, they want peace with China. So they say, yeah, great, fantastic. Just one thing, says the emperor of Vietnam. You know, the boundary between our two countries is a river, the Mekong, the Red River. We're going to have to transport the elephants from this side of the river, which is Vietnam, to your side of the river, which is China. We'll call it China for the moment. And the representatives of the Chinese emperor says, oh, no matter, no problem, build the rafts, put the elephants on, and we'll pay for the transport. And everybody says, yes, what a perfect solution, and we'll do it. And of course, you know, the cost of the raft is the cost of the elephant. And have you spotted the deliberate mistake? No, you're all looking at me and saying, I'm stupid. Elephants can swim, they don't need rafts. But everybody knew that. The Chinese emperor, imperial officials knew that. The Vietnamese officials knew that. They all knew that. This was a way of maintaining peace. This is what you do in the region. You know, it's very rare that you get. I mean, the Chinese, historically, Chinese armies are known for winning battles, but they never fight them. That's the whole point of the exercise of what's going on here. So, when we say that China's rising, yeah, of course China's rising. China's influence is very important in the region, but the region has ways of knowing what it's about. Now, that brings us on to the second concept I want to have a look at, which is, of course, empire. And there's no more, I was looking for symbols of empire, and there's no more solid symbol of the empire than, of course, the Great Wall. And the Great Wall is another myth that, en passant, we might dispose with. People will tell you, you can see the Great Wall from space. Bullshit. You can, no such thing. You can barely sometimes see the Great Wall when you're standing next to it. This is the Great Wall in the Gansu corridor that goes from Wuwei up to into the desert towards Xinjiang. It's not there. So when people tell you you can see the Great Wall from space, yeah, it's a very nice idea. But it's a bit like many other things we're going to deal with. I'm a political scientist originally, and I've been coming to China for over 40 years. And as you probably know, I speak a bit of Chinese, and I travel occasionally by bus and by taxi in particular. And often when I'm in a taxi, people say to me, the taxi driver says to me, how can you speak Chinese? And I can't say 40 years ago I couldn't say I was a political scientist. I'd get arrested. So I used to say I'm a historian. And of course that was a mistake, because the taxi driver would then say, you're a historian? Oh yes, China has 5,000 years of history. And I, of course, would say something like, if I was in a bad mood, or a good mood actually, if I was in a bad mood I'd shut up, but if I was in a good mood I would say, 5,000 years of history? I thought it only started in 1912. And they would look at me and as if to say, what kind of historian are you? What? But of course, the fact is that China did not call itself China until 1912. That is the first recorded time. Actually, the word Zhongguo, those of you who can read Chinese characters or can hear me say Zhongguo, this word was only invented in about 1898. Do you know where it was invented? Do you know where it was first written? Anybody know? A man called Zhang Taiyan sat in a house in Suzhou, hooray! Just round the corner from where I now live. And he wrote, and he said, we need to call ourselves something as a modern nation state, and we will call ourselves Zhongguo, China, right? Of course, it doesn't mean the Middle Kingdom. I'm sorry to tell, this is another myth breaking, I'm afraid, but I'm sorry to tell you, it doesn't really mean the Middle Kingdom. It would be nice if it did, because then you could have all kinds of puns like Muddle Kingdom and God knows whatever. It doesn't mean that at all. Zhong does, under certain circumstances, mean centre, and guo certainly means country. But the name Zhongguo it's like an abbreviation in English. It's the bringing together of two characters to represent other characters. And the character that the Zhong comes from is this character, is this word, Zhongyuan, which is a very old Chinese political concept, Zhongyuan. It means the central plain. Now you would think that the central plain was a flat area, but this is not a geographical term. This is a political term. It means the locus of political authority in the empire. And wherever political authority is, it's the central plain. It could be, and it often was, as you know, Chinese cities are almost universally flat. But flatness has got nothing to do with it. It's the location of political space. Where does the word China come from then? I hear you ask me, because you should be doing if you're not. Well, of course, it comes probably from Marco Polo, the man who never came to China. Why? He didn't need to come to China. He just needed to know about the myths of China, about the myths of the exotic, because in European languages, China, whatever, means exotic. India, Far East for the English, this part of the world is the exotic part of the world. And so that's how it became known as China. If you go to, I told you I'm going to Mexico on Friday. So in Mexico, in the New Spain days, they had a very rigid caste system, 16 different castes, depending on who you were, who you were born to, what the colour of your skin was, and so on. They had 16 different castes, and the three most extreme mixtures of races, which were blacks, whites, and Indians, were called Chino, Chinese. Not because they looked Chinese in any sense at all, but simply because they were exotic. This is a linguistic definition. Why we then start calling China China is simply because it's the exotic coast. And for many English people in the 17th century and the 18th century, China was both India and China. And you probably know the phrase Indochina. But Indochina wasn't Indochina because it was in between India and China. It's just a repetition of words for exotic East. And that's what it came down. This is one of my favourite examples of the non-Chinese Chinese. Some of you will know this. This is Potsdam in Berlin. This is the so-called Chinese Pavilion. What makes it Chinese? Well, some emperor decided he wanted to have an exotic pavilion, so he designed this. And of course, somewhere around there's a dragon, I think, on top. Yeah, up there's a dragon. But other than that, it has nothing to do with China, because Chinese tourists love to go there and be told, here is the Chinese Pavilion. When the Chinese wanted to call them... Oh, sorry, before I get on to this. Yes, excuse me. The other thing is you should be asking me, well, hang on a minute, what did the people in China call themselves before 1912? And what did they call the country? And you know the answer to that, if you're Chinese, and I see some of you are. And the answer is they called themselves after the dynasty. If they lived in Qing China, they were Qing people. And the country was Qing China, or Qing, the Qing dynasty. You've heard the phrase Chinatown. Right? What's China? How do you say Chinatown in Chinese? You don't say Zhongguozheng or anything like that. You say Tangrenjian. Why? Because it's the streets of the Tang people. Because it was in the Tang dynasty that people started going out of China around the world and setting up diasporic communities. So the word in Chinese for a Chinatown is actually the streets of the Tang people, even though, of course, regrettably, the Tang dynasty is long behind us. I say regrettably because, of course, the Tang dynasty is one of the most sophisticated, cultured, and super dynasties that China ever had. Not least, of course, because it was based on, at least in part, on Shanxi province, which is really the centre of the world. I won't bore you with that just now. When the Chinese wanted to talk about themselves as here, as opposed to people as here, rather than just the Tang dynasty or the Qing dynasty, they used the phrase the world, Tianxia. Everything under heaven, Tianxia, everything under heaven. And that's the whole point. The Chinese empire was not a nation state. It was an empire of very large extent. The emperor was the representative of heaven on earth. Everybody who lived here was the world. The boundaries, there were no boundaries to the Chinese Empire. There could not be. And of course, in different dynasties, the empire extended to different places. In the Tang dynasty, which I was just rabbiting on about, it went as far as Samarkand. In other dynasties, it went in different directions. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't a nation-state type thing. And that's actually quite important. I was reminded about this a couple of years ago when I was in Sichuan province. Anybody know who this is a picture of? Yeah, well done. You must be Chinese. Okay, so this is Li Bai. For those of you who don't know who Li Bai was, Li Bai is a famous Tang dynasty poet. And I was in Mianyang in West China, in Sichuan province, north of Chengdu, and I was there with a couple of Chinese friends, and we had a day to spare. So we decided to go and see the Li Bai family compound, right? And we rehearsed before we went, all the things we knew about Li Bai, other than that he was a famous poet. One of them was that he wasn't born here in Sichuan. He was born in Samarkand, where his father was a magistrate. And the other was that his mother actually was probably not Chinese. His mother was a Miao. Okay. So we go to this compound. Very nice it was too, but it was a grey, as in Chengdu often, it was a grey day, trying to rain, and nobody else was there. And this guide, this official guide, was all dressed up and female, trying to look nice and trying to look eager and keen. And she was standing. She said to us, "Do you want a guide?" Of course, we didn't. But what do you say in those kinds of circumstances? So we say, "Yeah, show us around." She said, "Oh, well, good," she said, and she started off. She said, "Welcome to the family home of Li Bai. This is where Li Bai was born and grew up." Oh, so there's a hiatus. One of my friends says to the guy, "Oh, excuse me, I thought he was born in Samarkand and he lived there until he was 6. And the guy goes, "We used to think that, but recent historical research has proved that he was born here." And she showed us around, and she was very pleasant. I mean, she was probably a history graduate from Sudan or something. She was very pleasant, and she showed us around. We went, and towards the end, she showed us a statue of Li Bai, not too dissimilar to that actually. And she said, "Look, he had this long beard." It was a bit longer in the statue than I thought. And my other friend goes, "Oh, he had a long beard." You may or may not know, but generally speaking, Chinese are not hirsute. Their body hair is somewhat limited. So how come he had a beard? So one of my other friends says to the guy, he had a beard because his mother was a Miao, not Chinese. The guy goes, "We used to think that." But recent research has proved it was Chinese. Now, of course it's amusing, but it's actually important, because what this points to is the nationalist project that's going on here. The boundaries of China have to include everything that is now Chinese, including the most famous poets. The people have to be Chinese. There's a rewriting of the past, rewriting history, to make it Chinese, even when it wasn't. And that, of course, brings us, by the way, just to show you where that was down there, around there. That brings us on to the third myth of China, about ethnicity. Although China started calling itself China in 1912, the recognition that all Chinese were different actually came a bit earlier, in 1906. The Manchu, when the system was beginning to collapse, recognized that they would have to go in for some kind, in the first decade of the 20th century, they recognized they had to go in for some kind of political modernization against their better judgment. So one of the things they did was that they allowed provincial assemblies of local elites and a form of democracy. But they also recognized 5 nationality groupings. Themselves, the Manchu, the Hanzu, following on Jiang Taiyan and his mates, all invented the notion of the Han, being an ethnic group. The notion, why were they called Han? Because we, he said, we are the sons of the Yellow Emperor, and the Yellow Emperor was the Han Emperor. But there's, you know, I mean, other than that, there's no rhyme or reason to it. But it's an invented thing from the same period as the creation of the notion of China. It's part of political modernization. And then Tibetans, Mongols, and Hui. Hui are Chinese who are Muslims, of course. Predominantly found in northwest China, but also found all over the place. And the Qing dynasty, the Manchu, accepted, said, yes, well, we'll have all this. But of course, that didn't last very long, and it didn't forestall the obvious, the inevitable collapse of the empire in 1911 and 1912. What happened subsequently, though, was that ethnic issues got tied up with civil war and war in the next 20, 30 years. And the Communist Party, by virtue of a few accidents of history, including the Long March, where they were pushed west and into the non-Chinese heartlands of China, they found themselves embracing the idea of saying, no matter what ethnicity you may be, the Communist Party will support you. So that when they came to power after 1949, they were more or less forced to adopt an ethnic policy towards other nationality groups other than the Chinese. There's a problem with this. Again, there's a Suzhou aspect to this story, by the way. The man who was put in charge of identifying all the nationality groups around China was Fei Xiaotong, who is a native of Suzhou, or Wujiang, in the south, towards the south of the city, and is one of the more famous anthropologists that China, in fact, the most famous anthropologist that China has ever created. He had work groups, they went around the whole country, and they identified 434 different non-Chinese nationality groups. Just a problem with that, they were only 8% of the population, and the state couldn't afford to support 434. So the party state decided, okay, you can have 55, and that's our final offer. And they did in the about 54, 55, they had officially designated 55 of these groups, 56 being the Han. And they made some criteria for these groups, which were that they had a homeland, in other words, they lived in an area, they had their own language, they had their own identity, and that, although it wasn't put in the documentation, they also had to have a critical mass. So where they were too small, okay, so in most cases, in many cases, there was no big problem. But they did make some real, I think the technical phrase would be stuff-ups, in ensuring that some of these 434 who came together in nationality groups were put in the wrong grouping. The most staggeringly obvious bad example is the Naxi and the Mosul, who are in southwest China. Because the Naxi are, actually I've better try and get this right, the Naxi are patrilineal, but the Mosul are matrilineal. The Naxi are Buddhists, and the Mosul are shamans. So, and apart from that, they don't speak the same language, but they do live within 10 kilometers of each other. So they were said to be a single nationality group. Now, of course, you can understand that from the state's point of view, this makes a great deal of sense. It doesn't particularly make much sense from the local people's point of view. 8% of the population are really in those nationality groups. So really, when we're talking about the Chinese not all being the same, we can shunt them. You know, I don't want to be nasty to any of the nationality groupings, but we can really shunt them off to one side. It's the 92% of the population who are said to be Han that we really need to focus on, to ask ourselves, are they all the same? Well, my argument to you would be that actually ethnic groups are, yes, ethnic groups exist, but ethnic groups usually have common languages, common customs, do things the same way, have a common history and shared history. And they always have, of course, from a social science point of view, a myth of origin. Now, the one thing the Chinese don't have, as you probably know, is a myth of origin. I mean, even with Jiang Kaiyan saying, we are the sons of the Yellow Emperor, they don't have a myth of origin. Why not? Well, I'll tell you why not. Think about your Chinese history. What did Qin Shi Huangdi do when what did the first Qin emperor do when he unified the country? He buried the scholars and he burnt the books. Why did he bury the scholars and burn the books? Okay, he was slightly anti-intellectual and he graduated from XJTLU. I understand that. But why did he do it? He did it because he didn't want competing ideas of the state to be out there. He wanted to impose on what was becoming China, as far as he was concerned, or call it the Qin Empire, he wanted to impose his idea of history. I have to say that the man who advised him on this was not a native of Suzhou. So, hooray again! But those myths of origin do exist. They still exist. And if you go around China, as I like to do, you can collect some of these myths. You can hear about them. This is one of my favourites. This is something you see sometimes talked about in many places in China. It's called the marriage of the princess of the rats. You can see, there she is, right? And she married the prince of the cats. A marriage made in heaven. You know, the rats and the cats, they never used to get on. They get married, they live happily ever after. Well, actually they didn't. The story is that at the wedding, his relatives ate hers. But more seriously, this is the myth of origin of the people of Linfa in southwest Shanxi. They believe, or they believed when they were allowed to have their myth of origin, that this is where they were descended from. They were descended from the marriage of the princess of the rats and the prince of the cats. And there are many, many myths of origin like this. In Wuhan, you probably don't even know this, the people believed, or used to believe, that they were descended from a spring in the rock that was fertile, became suddenly fertile at some point in history. And there's these myths of origin. Now, if you have a myth of origin, you can talk about an ethnic group. If you don't have a myth of origin, what are you doing? And with the Chinese, it's quite clear that they don't share many things. They don't even share language, you know? North, south, east, west, people do things differently. My wife is Australian, actually, to be perfectly honest. She's third generation Chinese Australian. Her family come from Zhongshan. They actually speak English at home, which makes it very funny if we go out anywhere in a Chinese-speaking environment. Her brother-in-law says, ho, ho, ho. Well, you know, takes me to the Mandarin Club in Sydney, puts his arm around me in front of his mates and says, ho, 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 this is my brother-in-law. He speaks Chinese. Isn't he an idiot, kind of thing. He doesn't speak Chinese at all, he speaks English. But they have their Chinese ways, what they consider their Chinese ways. They eat rice. They don't eat spicy food. They wouldn't touch lamb with a barge pole, right? They have sugary stuff. Me, I lived in North China, in Shanxi province, as I said to you before. In the north, rice, you've got to be joking. We eat noodles. We have vinegar on anything. We drink so much vinegar you can drown in it. Noodles, vinegar, lamb, yes, lamb is the meat of... and that's just a simple contrast between two places in China. Multiply that by the vast population of China and the vast places in China, and you can begin to understand that this is a very strange notion of ethnicity that we're actually talking about. The way people marry, the way they die, the way they do all kinds of things are varied from place to place. I reckon myself county by county people differ, and there are about 2,200 counties in China. So you begin to get some impression about the variety. And when it comes down to language, don't even think about it. I mean, if you're a foreigner, you think all Chinese speak Mandarin. Well, yes and no. Some Chinese speak a variety of standard Chinese as their first language, but the majority don't. They grow up speaking something else. They learn at school. These days they learn at school. When I first started coming to China, I remember being in the south of China. I wanted to buy a musical instrument in Canton. I went into a shop, and you know, I'd only been learning Chinese for 10 years, and I was a bit... In those days you couldn't get to China. This was my first time coming to China. I was trying out my newfound existence being in China on my own. I went into a music shop. I tried to buy a sona, which is a reed instrument, a rural reed instrument. And I said to the music owner, can I buy a sona in my best, put on my best standard Chinese? They didn't understand me at all. I had to point and grunt. It was years before I realized later, they probably didn't speak modern standard Chinese. They spoke Cantonese, and I don't speak it. Another story, I have a very good friend, who I've worked with in Shanxi for years. And one spring morning, we were doing field work in the countryside, and in Licheng County, and up in the Taihang Mountains, beautiful. The mist is coming up from the valley. We both independently thought we'd go for a walk in the little county town. It's beautiful, absolute sun was shining, it was lovely. So we're walking along, and I'm talking to him in my variety of modern standard Chinese, and he's talking to me, and this old peasant comes up, and he says to me, "Is your friend Japanese?" No, I said, "It's from Jiaotong, there's 3 counties." "Why do you think he's Japanese?" "Well, I don't understand a word he says," he said. And it was just like that, you know. This is not unusual in China. People do not naturally speak the same language. If you go around most counties in China, get hold of the county gazetteer. What's the last chapter? Well, the last chapter is usually famous people who've lived in this county. But the penultimate chapter is usually a guide to the language. How is it pronounced, what its vocab is, and all kinds of things like this. Of course, the educational system tells people to use modern standard Chinese, but that's it. So I'm coming to an end of my comments, and I'll let you ask questions in it, but I was trying to find some photographs I'm a photographer, in case you hadn't realized. I always wanted to be a photographer when I was a little boy growing up, and I didn't want to be an academic, but I found out about the age of 11 that photographers earn less money than academics, so I stuck with the profession. Anyhow, I've taken photographs, as you probably know. You can see there's some of them around China over the years. And so these are some from China, representing the different ways that people live in houses, which really shows you that they don't share a common geography, let alone common identity. So this is Chongqing. This no longer exists. This is the way people used to live in Chongqing when the Kuomintang were there, when it was the capital. This is a cave house in Shanxi. There are 3 kinds of cave houses in Shanxi: the ones that go in, the ones that go down, and the ones that you build up round. But she's peeling potatoes, by the way. So if you think potatoes are not Chinese, you got that wrong too. This you know. This is Suzhou. Yes. Suzhou seems to crop up, doesn't it? This is Chaojiao. If you've seen Raise the Red Lantern, this is where they film Raise the Red Lantern. This is fantastic. This is a 19th century workers' model village in Fujian. And that's on the southeast coast too. This is Wujiang, where Mao Dun was born and raised and grew up. I think that is too, actually. I don't know what I've got on there. And this, who knows where this is? I show people this picture and say, where do you think this is? Most people say southern Germany. Qingdao, well done! Not bad, not bad. That's because I said southern Germany. Yeah, well, it's a bit like southern Germany. But all these, and this is where Li Bai was born. Or wasn't. Right? This is the Li Bai family compound. So the point of all this is, these are all different kinds of architecture, of course, that go with different. So 3 conclusions to finish off. China, we can call it China now, but it's not a country. It's a continent. Thinking of it as, yeah, of course. Look, please don't misunderstand me before we go any further. China rising, yes, but keep it in perspective. China long history, yes, but keep it in perspective. China ethnicity, yes, but keep all these 3 things you have to keep in perspective. China is wealthy, but it's got a long way to go. A long way to go. This is not a capitalist country. It's a state, what do you call it, market socialist country in reform. And it's got a long way to go. It's got to develop the interior. It's got to develop a consumer society. And to do that, it needs a welfare system that it doesn't have, and it needs a taxation system that it doesn't have. And without those, it's not going to make all those things. What we have is a country which is really a continent that's in the process of moving from being an empire into being a modern nation state. And we're all privileged. We're living through it, and it's exciting and it's fun, and sometimes it's very frustrating. But it's a process, and it's not to be equated with your United States or your Germany or your France. Even by the best estimate, 13,000 American dollars per head, PPP, GDP, is a very low level of development. And you can say, well, but it's distributed strangely, and indeed it is distributed strangely. But when it comes down to it, the comparison is just not there. So, yes, it's the richest country in the world in some ways, but not in others. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. By way of advertising China Studies events, let me tell you that we have one of these China talks. There's some leaflets out there if you want, and it lists all the other China talks on the back. All the other people in the department are far better talkers than me, and the lectures will be very, very interesting. Can I also bring to your attention the China Studies Summer School, which will be in July, as always, next year. This is, get yourself a brochure, sign up now, because places are going quick. It's one of the most amazing social and educational opportunities you will ever have the opportunity to do. And on that note, thank you very much.